Hello, I'm Michael Wade of Appalachian State's History Department. Welcome to the Academics. There's been a lot of news this week, and this is your opportunity to listen in as we talk about it. Our academics are from my right, Lee Dunstan from the Walker School of Business, Dr. Nancy Love of Appalachian's Department of Government and Justice Studies, and Dr. Paul Gates of our Department of Communication. Now let's get to it. Our topics today are right-wing hate groups online and in our midst. Should the public be concerned, and if so, on what grounds? Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change. Is climate change only a scientific matter? Is it a moral issue? And is the Pope meddling in politics when he brings up the subject of climate change? And finally, time permitting, fringe GOP candidates, what makes them run? With regard to hate groups and their websites, there, of course, has been a third murderous assault on a religious institution. There have been 3 in the past 3 years. In each case, the killers were frequenters of internet white power websites. Dylan Storm Roof, just days ago, murdered 9 Emmanuel AME parishioners in Charleston. He acknowledges the Council of Conservative Citizens website as his primary ideological influence. Just 3 days before Roof committed mass murder at Mother Emanuel, Earl Holt III, president of the Council of Conservative Citizens, suggested taking a .45 caliber pistol into the black community to, quote, help mitigate violent crime at its source, unquote. He previously advocated lynching black citizens, quote, a tall tree, a short rope, and a good knot are not an expensive endeavor, unquote. The CCC forecasts on its website a coming race war and counsels its followers to consider the exploits of General Nathan Bedford Forrest in dealing with it. Questions. How persuasive are these websites? Are they as influential as the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Jewish Anti-Defamation League think that they are? Or are these just recent tragedies, these murders, signs of rising tensions and alienation produced by fears about the future, including complaints that Christianity is under assault, that history in school is being taught by teachers who hate America, and that whites are victims of favoritism toward minorities? What do you think, Nancy?
Well, if we look at the number of users of these websites, one could infer that they are influential. Stormfront, one of the major websites, has, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, 300,000 users, and 2/3 of them are in the U.S. And among those users, Wade Michael Page and Anders Behring Breivik, who are known for hate crimes. Vanguard News Network, another major website, was being used by Fraser Glenn Miller, who was involved in the Kansas shootings. They're part, though, of a larger picture, which is a dramatic increase in hate groups in the United States since 2000, and even more since 2009, following the 2008 election of President Barack Obama. So I think they need to be seen in context. And that dramatic rise in hate groups, neo-Nazi, KKK, white nationalists, neo-Confederate, black separatist, border vigilantes, historical revisionist, they often ally. And there is a conscious attempt now to create an international alliance among these groups, especially neo-Nazi, KKK. But they are distinct groups, and that makes their numbers more difficult to track. The one other thing I would say about the power of these websites, they're not only forums and sort of ideology, they also have music, that can be streamed. And hate music is a powerful influence, particularly on alienated teenagers. And that's one of the target groups they're trying to attract.
Mhm.
So I guess my question is, what do we do about this? I mean, generally speaking, this kind of speech is protected by the First Amendment, and I think we all would agree with that. So the question is, what do we do about it, if anything, other than insist that law enforcement and other persons who are vigilant about watching whether these things can slip out of control, as they obviously have, whether law enforcement is monitoring these websites, and I'm sure that it is. I guess the question then becomes whether or not, when speech on these websites slides into advocacy that amounts to attempting to incite deadly or other physical violence, then it slips over the line and becomes something that can be legitimately looked at as potentially violating law. It's a very tough question, and I'm assuming that law enforcement is watching this stuff every second. If they're not, they absolutely must.
I would agree with both Nancy and Lee's assessment here of the prevalence and the influence and so forth of the hateful websites on the internet, and also I think it's important to kind of look at where the law stands in regard to clear and present danger, which is the legal phrase of what we're talking about, at the point which speech can be turned off, can be, and I don't mean to use that as an internet kind of phrase, but where speech can be punished. The court over the years, over the last 50 years or so, has reached a point where I think protection for speech has reached its furthest point. It's as protected as can be. Under the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision from 1969, the court came up with and applied as the critical term in the speech analysis, incitement, and required incitement before speech can be punished, can be prescribed. And that's, I think, as far as it can go. Beyond incitement, the only place to go after that is conduct or action. And that has always been punishable. So I think we've protected the speech as much as we can. It's now time to look at incitement and, as Lee was describing a minute ago, monitor these sites and act when appropriate.
I'm curious about that because it gets, part of the difficulty is, and I'd ask Paul to kind of work this through with us, what does incitement mean in this context? You know, I mean, when is it that, for instance, when somebody suggests short rope, you know, and lynching is a good alternative, is that moved toward incitement? Is that incitement type language? And is incitement tied up with clear and present danger? And I think it is, and I think, as you said, it is, Paul. So the question is, what is incitement under these circumstances? Can we say, when we've had these experiences, these unbelievable experiences with these people who have murdered people, who have been watching this stuff, can we say there is a sufficient body of evidence so that incitement has now been reached when certain things are said or promoted on these websites?
If I could jump in there too, how many murders does it take, and what is the causal chain that we really need to see? Because according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, again, Stormfront users have murdered 100 people in the last 5 years. Now, one can debate those numbers, but that strikes me as arguably a case that incitement is occurring.
I have a question, and
Throwing
it's
this all at
related.
you.
It's related to these. Whatever happened to, I think maybe you covered it, but does Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous dictum that there is no right to shout fire in a crowded theater no longer apply?
No, I think that was the beginning, of course. That was Schenck versus the United States, the beginning of the clear and present danger test. But I think he was talking about incitement. He didn't use the word, but that's what he was getting at. The way the rest of the court reacted to that, they didn't quite get what Holmes was moving toward. It took them a number of years before they caught on. It took a change in the court as well before they got to what Holmes was talking about. But I think that's still the fundamental analysis. And I was thinking when Nancy was just here a minute ago talking about when is the point reached. The traditional analysis that we've talked about is these kinds of statements being made in speeches and so forth, and sort of one-off comments. But when we're talking about the internet here, and Nancy's talking about this, and I think she's right, that we have constant exposure to these internet sites. It's just sort of an aggregation of these hateful things that, taken together at some point, and it's hard to judge that point, except after the fact, at some point that incitement happens. And when is somebody going to react? When are they going to be motivated finally to do something violent?
Mm-hmm.
With respect to white power music, some scholars have argued that its users are practicing emotional violence. And so one could argue that that is a type of action.
I think anybody who's ever listened to it would probably get, if not agree, at least get the idea.
Yeah.
There's a fascinating thing about that music. If you read the lyrics of the songs, a lot of them don't. A lot of the compositions don't rise to the level even of doggerel. But you take those same words and put them to music, and they acquire a power that they didn't previously have. It's really quite remarkable. I think parents should probably be more aware not only of these websites, but also of the power that's inherent in this music. It's no accident that there are probably as many hate-core bands as there are websites, and they're spread all the way from northern Europe to northwestern North America and Canada.
It may be worth mentioning that in some societies, for instance in Germany, if you are a Holocaust denier, you have committed a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and yet in our notion of our constitutional First Amendment rights, this conversation, it becomes extremely difficult. And I'll speak for myself. It's extremely difficult for me to not to insist on clear and convincing proof that there is some causal connection between this kind of speech and these websites, and doing anything to limit the speech, the horrible speech that is put forth on those websites. And I think that's a tough road to hoe. But I'm willing to have people make the effort, and I'm interested to see that they do.
Two thoughts. One is, as I was sort of researching this, it occurred to me that one factor in the erosion of will to go after these links, not just the websites, but the link between the words and what follows in some cases, is the 30 to 40 years that we've experienced now of anti-government rhetoric. And I think that in some way must have undermined the will of authorities, whether they're judicial, executive, or legislative, to stand up to some of these things. I'm thinking about that rancher who was grazing his cattle on government land without paying for it, and the government in effect backing down in the face of people who had no legal standing whatever in the confrontation, and wondering, would that have happened, 30 or 40 years ago, and should it have happened?
Good question.
I think the answer to that, Mike, is no. I think what allowed Clive Bundy, I believe his name was, to get that kind of support, I mean, you can mobilize the troops pretty quickly through the internet. Before there was an internet, it would have been him and his brother or something, and they would have been standing out there all by themselves. But through the modern media, particularly the internet, others become aware of his stance and jump in their vehicles and drive down to his ranch. He can spread the word very quickly. And I think that's true with everything with the internet. It gives the reach, and I think Nancy in her first comments talking about this, the reach is just tremendous at little expense. For the same money that 40 or 50 years ago would have bought you a few hundred flyers that you pass out on a street corner, for that same money you can get somebody to write some HTML code and web host your hateful website for that same amount, and reaching untold thousands of times more people than you ever could have dreamed of 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, here's the second question. Given that Dylan Roof credited the Conservative Citizens website as his ideological influence, his inspiration, is that not actionable? He made the link. Government didn't.
I think the issue is, can it be said that what the website is doing amounts to, as Paul has pointed out, imminent or clear and present danger amounting to incitement? Or was this young man so deranged as to completely go off track? And I've never listened to any of these websites, so I don't know. I get the impression, Mike, that you have looked at a couple of them.
Considerably, yeah.
Yeah.
I have as well.
And
Nancy,
They're
more
not
than any
subtle.
of us.
and so I'm getting from the conversation that you think that there might be, on an impressionable, not necessarily insane mind, but an impressionable, ideologically driven mind, they may move toward incitement.
Oh, yeah,
I think so.
I do.
There's another little problem there. This is introducing the issue of foreseeability. Was it foreseeable that this conservative citizens, their material would have that effect on that actor? And the answer, that's a hard case to make. It's not enough to be able to say somebody might react that way. You've got to be able to draw a very close connection between the two, and that makes it harder. It makes it no less important, more important probably, but it's a hard case to make.
Well, this is a big issue, and there'll be more about it, I'm sure. Let's talk a bit about Pope Francis's encyclical. Is the much admired Pope meddling in politics, as some conservatives charge?
What's wrong with that? I mean, I don't know that his intent is to meddle in politics, but by asking the world to see climate change as a moral issue, to heed the warnings of nature, and to fight for social justice, especially for the poorer people of the world who bear the brunt of climate change. Of course, he's going to have political effects. And the question is how candidates who deny the science of climate change and are religious, Christians, sometimes Catholics, are going to
Several of
navigate
them
this.
are Catholic.
Yeah.
I want to note here that the Pope was trained as a chemist
Yes.
before he went,
And that kind of goes to the
another
point I
direction.
was going to make, Mike. I think that it's crucially important that the Pope starts with science in the encyclical. And what he's basically saying, I think, is that if you accept the science, which is overwhelming, that climate change is occurring and that it is having a devastating impact on the Earth, and that the follow-on effects are dramatic, particularly for the poor of the Earth, who have so many less alternatives than the rest of us, then once he accepts the science, and he does, and as you say, he was trained in science, he has no alternative. And as a moral leader, he has no alternative but to come public and take a position, which he has done. And so I was delighted to see it. And I really do, in a lot of ways, I think it is a game changer. I think it is a game changer. I think that when a person of Pope Francis's stature takes a position in a measured, thoughtful way, as he did in the encyclical, I think it is a game changer. It's going to take time, but I do think it's a game changer.
Another question, is climate change only a scientific matter?
No, absolutely not. And I think this is where the Pope is very important. The Pope doesn't represent the Vatican. That's not only his responsibility. He represents Catholics. He represents all kinds of people of faith all around the world in an issue that, just in the same way, affects the entire world. So the political angle, I think, is overplayed. This really is not a political issue. If this had to do with something going on in Canada only, or in Brazil or something like that, perhaps. But it's not. This is something that is of such dimension that it affects everybody, every place in some way. And so you need somebody like the Pope who has that kind of bully pulpit to step in and do exactly what he's done.
I'm going to disagree with you a bit on
Oh,
that,
good.
in that,
Controversy.
well, political issues don't need to be confined to nation-state borders. And so if we have a problem with developing international law for a global world, I think the Pope has given us a new way of thinking about that, and a new incentive to proceed with something other than conferences and treaties that are not enforceable.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you used the word confined, because the conservatives, particularly the neocons, insist that the science is wrong, but they also insist that this is, in effect, wholly a scientific matter. And they can't have their cake and eat it too, although they will keep trying, undoubtedly. It's not just a scientific issue, and anyone who just looks at the literature that's out there will see that it's coming from philosophers, political scientists, from all parts of the intellectual spectrum. And an encyclical is a teaching letter. Teaching is ministry. Both John Paul II and Benedict the 16th wrote about industrial pollution's role in destroying the environment. And in fact, Benedict initiated projects to make the Vatican carbon neutral. This one is another one of those stay tuned. We are pretty nearly out of time. I was pretty sure that we would not actually get to the business of the fringe candidates, but have no fear, they will be with us in the many weeks to come. That's our program. We'd like to hear from you concerning your thoughts about the academics. Feel free to contact us through our website, www.watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Michael Wade for the Academics.